How are you?
Hey, Kate, how's it going?
Going well. Michelle, JC, nice to have you. I'm going to just pause the recording as we're kind of doing some stuff to get ready.
Thank you all so much, for having me.
This meeting is being recorded.
And as Kate mentioned at the beginning, no worries, as Kate mentioned at the beginning, if you could rename yourselves with your full name and where you're from, it would just be great to see who's here. I think once I start sharing my screen, I'll no longer have access to the chat, so I won't be able to see necessarily all of your responses to some questions that I'm about to ask. But as we go through this slide deck today, I might pause and come back and just sort of see some of the answers in the chat, and or for those of you who'd like to go off mute and discuss more, that sounds great too. So I will start sharing my screen so you can see this slide deck. And we can get started. So as Kate mentioned, my name is Lindsay Moore, and I am a principal advisor at the Behavioral Insights team, which I will tell you a little bit more about in a moment. But I'm just really excited to be here today because I also head up all of our state and federal government work here at the Behavioral Insights team. In my past life before joining BIT, I worked for the governor of Colorado on his performance management team. That was back when Governor Hickenlooper was still there in the state, now Senator Hickenlooper. And then before that, I've worked for other foreign governments as well as governments in the US. And I'm always excited to talk to other government employees because in our family, I'm like the 6th generation of state or federal government employee or local government employee. So I get really excited to just hear about, your challenges and what kind of work you do and how, now I guess in this role, how Behavioral Insights might be able to help. So hopefully today's session will be informative and exciting and teach you something new about behavioral science. So, and actually, while I'm getting started, one quick question, and again, I'll come review it when I can see the chat again later, but if you could type a 1 in the chat, if you've heard about Behavioral Insights before, you know what nudges are or anything like that, that would be great. If you've never heard of this before and it's brand new to you, feel free to type 2 in the chat as well, and that's totally fine. We're gonna start from the beginning. So for today's session in particular, I'm going to walk you through like who BIT is, so who is the Behavioral Insights team, and the concept of behavioral science more generally. And then I think the vast majority of the time that we'll spend together in this first hour, we'll just walk through BIT's EAST framework for applying behavioral science and what that looks like. You'll see some examples in practice. So most of these are with local governments because that's where BIT started here in the US, is mostly working with Bloomberg Philanthropies What Works Cities program at the local level. But a lot of these ideas I think you'll find are applicable to state government and work as well. And then feel free to ask questions throughout. As I mentioned, I'm not going to be able to see the chat right now and I can't see you all, but ask your questions in the chat, write them down. We'll have about 30 minutes at the end. I'm a fast talker with a lot of content, so feel free to interrupt me at any time, but we do have 30 minutes at the end to walk through some of your questions. And then obviously you all can feel free to go off mute. If you don't feel comfortable with that, either send Kate a private message. She can interrupt me at any point. You guys can also interrupt me at any point. And that's totally fine. If there's anything that you're like, that just doesn't make sense, or wait, how could I apply this to my work? Or can you expand on that a little bit? I'll try the best I can to give you a lot more detail if you want on any of these topics. So we've got a lot to cover, but again, feel free to ask those questions, save them to the end, whatever you prefer.
And Lindsay, just to jump in from the chat, we're seeing basically equal parts, some folks who have had some experience with behavioral insights, some folks who are totally new to it, and then we had Kristen from New Jersey give us a half, so 1/2, but it looks
nice.
like kind of evenly split down the middle.
Okay, perfect. All right, and for those of you who are familiar, also feel free to chime in with like stuff that you know or that you've learned, or things that might have been applicable to your work at the state level as well. I think that would be really great. Okay, great. So let me just start off by introducing who we are as a company at BIT. BIT is a global social purpose company, and we were actually founded in 2010 in the Prime Minister's office in London. So at the time, David Cameron was Prime Minister, and the book Nudge had just come out by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler. And he was like, how can we take what we know about this field of behavioral economics and behavioral science and start applying it to make government more effective and more efficient? And so he started the small nudge unit team. And as an aside, I was actually working in the UK Parliament at the time. So I was in the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee when David Cameron started this office. And I remember hearing about it thinking, really hubristically, like, oh, we're the real scientists in government. I was a neuroscience major and had gone to grad school for neuroscience. So I was like, oh, like this is never going to last. It's like the, you know, basically like the prime minister's new shiny object. And sure enough, like 10 years later, I'm working for them. So, you know, it was, I obviously had to eat my words, but at the time, you know, we were started out as a very small team that was looking into the applications of behavioral economics in government. And of course, we've grown to this, you know, much larger multinational company that now has 250 dedicated behavioral science professionals in 8 international offices. We've run over 1,000 behavioral insights projects with governments, so in 60 countries, including 8 randomized control trials, so rigorous research with governments. Those of you who are familiar with nudging and nudge units might be familiar with the OECD report that came out a couple years ago that talked about how there are now over 200 nudge units around the world, and we are the original one out of the UK. And as part of that, you know, we've trained over 12,000 civil servants like yourselves and other practitioners in behavioral insights and how to use this. And really, like, our raison d'etre is that we want to try to design policies, programs, and government services using more realistic models of human behavior. So we'll get more into that and what that means, and again, what that looks like in practice, but that's a little bit about BIT. The other thing I should just mention is that we spun out of government in 2014 and opened up an office in New York. I'm here in Washington, DC, so based out of our new DC office. And again, we came to the United States from the UK mostly to help start our work in with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the What Works Cities program back in 2015, and have since again grown. And we now have offices in our North America practice in Toronto, New York, and DC. So again, our approach is really about taking this field of behavioral economics and behavioral science, which is the study of how humans make choices and behave in a real world context, and then applying it with rigorous evaluation. So this is really about investigating these causal connections between treatment and outcomes, and we combine those two things together. So let me just take a step back and ask, like, what do we mean by behavioral insights, and what is this about, like, designing policies and programs for real humans in real world contexts, and what does that mean in practice? So in classical economics and in classical public policy, we oftentimes design public services expecting that people behave like this person here. Again, if we were all together, I would ask anybody, do you know who this is?
Lindsay, a quick question. Can
Yeah.
folks type in the chat, one, if you're just still seeing the introduction to behavioral insight slide, and 2, if you're seeing something else.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay. Do you want to try to reshare? If not, I'll just pop up my screen and, oh, whatever you did just worked.
Okay, this might actually, can you guys see the full?
We can see it.
You can see, even when I make it smaller, can you still see this?
It's a little smaller, but.
Okay, great. Oh no, so it wasn't advancing. I'll, just for posterity's sake, I will show you that we have an agenda. This is what we went through earlier. We'll go through each framework. This is you know, our intro to BIT slide. Is this working better, Kate? Should I just leave it as this?
I think we should, yeah. And thanks, Victor. We can see the ribbon and not the full screen, but I think this is good for us, and folks will also get the slides after. So okay. I'll let you keep going. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Sorry about that. Okay. So although, oh wait, then I've lost my, wait, if I start it from here, can you guys only see the intro, or can you still see, so what do we mean by behavioral insights?
All we see is, so what do you mean by behavioral insights?
And if I press forward, can you see this person?
I see a person driving a car and someone from Star Trek, although I'm kind of showing that I am not a Trekkie.
Okay. All right. I think this should work. I think we can keep it then going forward. Okay. So I think we've now lost all of the ability to do fancy animations, but you guys can stick with me, and hopefully this will not give away any like fun secret questions later. Okay. And yeah, Kate, let me know if I'll tell you when I'm going to the next slide, and just let me know if you can't see it, if that works.
Love it. And thanks for the crowd participation, folks.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So, so generally when we talk about what do we mean by behavioral insights, we usually design public services for Spock, right? So what does it, for those of you who are Trekkies, so not Kate, we know that Spock, right, is this person who makes purely rational decisions, right? Doesn't get influenced by emotion or distraction or other things like that, right? Infinite cognitive capacity. So we shouldn't design public services for Spock, and instead we need to be thinking about designing public services for this guy on the right? Somebody who's super distracted, trying to do a million things at once, and maybe is only going to give the letter or the form or the ask that we're asking of folks to do, 30 seconds of their time. So when we talk about behavioral science being the study of how humans make decisions and behave in the real world, what we're talking about is trying to measure and study people in their real environments that are going to be distracted by real things. And what we want to do also is update this model of humans as being, rational decision makers, because I think we all, suffer from limited cognitive bandwidth, and we don't, have tons of time and effort and attention to give, especially during, times of, 2-year plus pandemics. And as part of that, we ask questions like, how do our brains really work? And what shortcuts do we take when we make decisions? And so if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll take a quick side note to talk a little bit about this dual process theory of cognition, because this is really what underlies a lot of what we mean by behavioral insights. So what this means is there was a guy, some of you may have heard of this book, but a man named Daniel Kahneman wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow. Okay, I can see some of you, so I see some head nods. And in that book, Danny Kahneman, by the way, he's an amazing researcher. He's one of the only psychologists to ever win the Nobel Prize in economics. So really brilliant man. And he came up with this idea of system 1 and system 2. Again, as a former neuroscientist, I have to say these systems do not really exist in your brain. There is not like this lobe is 1 and this lobe is 2, but rather it's a theoretical way of thinking about how we process information, right? So system 1 is this idea of like fast, automatic, intuitive, or effortless thinking. So if I were to ask all of you, what is 2 times 2? Right? I think automatically you think 4, right? Like, the answer in your head. Same thing with when you like take your daily commute. Again, pre-pandemic times, some of you look like you're in offices. Others of you are probably still working from home. But that feeling when you like walk out your door, you get in the car, you drive to your work, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't even remember stopping at that light, because you do it every day, right? That's system 1. It's just automatic and intuitive. System 2 is the opposite of that. It's very slow, it's reflective, it's deliberate, it's analytical, and it requires a lot of effort. So if I were to ask you what's 24 times 17, right? Usually it's crickets. You'd need to think about it. You'd need to do it. If you have children who are learning math right now, you'd need to learn it their new way. You don't know, right? Like, unless you're Rain Man, that doesn't come to you automatically, right? Same thing like if you're planning a trip overseas, right? You need to think more deliberately about, where am I going to stay? How am I going to get there? It's new, it's novel, and it's a little bit more difficult for you. And so Danny Kahneman points out that these environmental factors predict behavior and have an impact on behavior in ways that are much greater than we thought previously. So we need to start taking those into account when we're talking about interacting with humans in a real environment. So system 1, again, that fast, automatic, intuitive way of thinking, works by trying to simplify decisions that we have to make into really simple rules, right? And it does that by using things like, what's our intuition? Our intuition is like an aggregate of all the experiences that we've had so far, right? How are we feeling on a particular day? What's our emotion, right? What kinds of mental shortcuts or rules of thumb can we start using to make different decisions? How do biases impact the way that we make decisions? And also social influence, right? We're naturally very social creatures. We take cues from others around us, like which way to face in an elevator or simple things like that. So again, system 1 works, by really simplifying that. And what we try to do when we look at government services is we try to think about like, how can we minimize the system 2 load that we're trying to place on the people that we interact with and shift to work with system 1 behaviors. So to do that, and again, I know this is a really quick overview of sort of what we do and how we do it. But to do that, we start by trying to understand barriers, right? What are the barriers to getting people to engage with you or your service or your program the way that you want them to do it, right? And we do that in a lot of ways. We start by doing things like observational studies and just watching how do people engage with this. So sometimes that literally means, if I'm a community college student trying to apply for, to register for a class, can I actually walk through the process and see where are people getting tripped up, right? We can also use data. So a lot of administrative data to say, where are people often not complying with what it is we want them to do? So whether it's like unemployment insurance, where are people making mistakes in applying for unemployment insurance? Are they not doing their work search actions? Are they filling out the forms incorrectly, et cetera? So we could look to administrative data to ask some of those questions and start to answer where are people falling off the process where we don't otherwise want them to be falling off. We can also do things like interviews and focus groups, right? It's always great to get to the source, to ask people directly, hey, what's going on? Where did you find this difficult? How might we make this easier for you? And then, of course, things like secondary research, right? There are a lot of tools out there about, what's worked, what are best practices in other contexts. And again, you guys probably know all of this, but we look to that to try to piece together where those barriers are and how we can make that make them go away so that we can, have again, more effective and efficient programs. Again, as a former state government employee, I know this all too well, which is that a lot of times like programs and services are designed from behind a desk. So when I was working for the governor of Colorado, right, like I got to sit behind my desk for 8 hours a day and design, the new like Lean Champion program. And in my mind, I knew everything about the program and what we wanted people to do and how people could best engage with it. But what I had to realize is that all of the people across the like 18 to 22 departments in the state weren't going to necessarily engage with that program in the same way that I was engaging with it, for multiple hours a day at my desk, right? So we really need to start thinking about like, how can I make it as easy as possible for the folks that I'm engaging with to really engage with the program? And it starts by asking questions. When we think about behavioral diagnosis, it starts with asking like, what is a behavioral barrier to engagement and what's not, right? And we have this, this triangle here, this pyramid diagram to go through how we think about it. And again, I know you guys will be getting these slides later, so you can look back on it. But basically, we start with the things at the top, like what are institutional barriers to engagement? So these are things like eligibility requirements, like, if you're not a certain age, you can't do certain things like drive or join the military or do other things like that, right? So that's, that's not what we deal with. That's more like a legal policy-based, issue or problem. The next one down are these situational barriers. So it could be that, you've got this amazing program that you want people to come to or engage in, but there's no public transit to there, or people just can't get there. It's not available at a convenient time, right? Those are more situational barriers. And you can think about like why people might not be engaging the way that you want through some of those like, physical, geographical, logistical barriers that they might be facing. Where behavioral insights in the field of behavioral science really focuses is on the bottom here about these cognitive and behavioral barriers. So these are things like, look, the language on your form is very legalese, right? It's complex, it's overwhelming. They don't understand the definition of, what you're trying to say. It doesn't resonate with a sort of popular vernacular in the same way that you might think it does. Or we're doing a lot of work right now on vaccine hesitancy, right? And wondering, people don't think that doctors or the vaccine are very trustworthy or things like that. So how could we use behavioral science to help people overcome these types of, feelings, biases, cultural norms, things like that, that might be getting in the way of them engaging the way that we want them to. So here is a graph that is definitely not drawn to scale. It's clearly very scientific for those of you who can see it. But what we wanted to illustrate on this graph is who we can nudge, right? So within these nudges, on the left, we have people, if you think about this as a graph, on the left-hand side of the x-axis here, it's people who always do what we want them to do. Think about these people as being the ones who always do their homework on time. And then we have, the kids, the students, whatever. And then on the right-hand side, it's people who are just determined not to comply. So in our little cute characteristics here, we've got Blameless Betty. Again, she's always doing what you want her to do on time, correctly. She's filling out the form. She's spending, tons of time to engage the way you want. On the far right hand side, we've got Malicious Margaret. Like, she will not pay her taxes no matter how much you try to nudge her. Like, she just does not want to engage. She believes that it is, whatever. She believes that that is not what she wants to do. And so therefore no amount of like nudging and creative content and letters is going to ever get her to like do what you want her to do on time. But most of us, and I think most people in general, are in the thicker part of this bell curve, right? They're right here in the middle. And there are people who are busy, who are distracted, or who sort of justify their behaviors as like, yeah, I wanted to do it, but, and you can think of all the excuses, to fill in that back half, right? So these are people who procrastinate, who forget, right? Who are really busy again, and like they've got 3 kids and doing a bunch of stuff, and they just don't have time to read the form very carefully that you've sent them and know exactly what they're supposed to do. And these are the people that we're trying to design nudges for, right? So these are the folks that we think can really benefit from behavioral insights and redesigning, the ways that we engage with them. So I'll take a brief, again, side note here to just say, how do we know what works? I know this is not an evaluation class. And when I do teach research methods and policy evaluation, this is about the time everybody has to go to the bathroom. So just stick with me for like 30 seconds here. But really the way that we at the Behavioral Insights team know what works is by running rigorous low-cost evaluations. Most of these take the form of randomized control trials when we can. This is sort of the gold standard. And I can walk you through really quickly. And all of the examples that I'm about to show you are randomized control trials. So I think it's important that you just understand the basics. And again, maybe this is repeat for some of you, brand new for others. But basically how an RCT works is that we take a population of people. Let's say it's everybody that's receiving a tax delinquency notice, right, in your state. Your Department of Revenue is sending out tax delinquency notices. It's like 100,000 people in the state of Colorado did not pay their tax on time this year. So we're going to send them all a letter. We randomly split them into two groups. And it's really important that it's random, right? Because basically what we're doing is solving for the fact that both of these groups are statistically identical to one another. Means that it's on average, same number of men and women, same number of people who have kids or don't have kids. And so we sort of make sure that they are as statistically equal on what we call both observable and unobservable characteristics, right? They all, like, on average ate the same, breakfast in the morning, whatever it is. By splitting them into two groups, one of those groups then gets the intervention. So they get the updated letter that says, hey, you didn't pay your tax on time. Everybody else in the state of Colorado paid their tax on time. Please pay your taxes, right? And the other group is what we call the control group, and they just get the standard letter that the Colorado Department of Revenue would send out, and that's just it. And by comparing the outcomes in both of those groups, so in that example that I gave you, it's who then paid their tax, right, after receiving the letter, or how quickly did they pay it, or what number of people paid it. We can start to measure the difference between those, and the difference between those can be causally attributed to the intervention itself, right? So we know that the only real difference between those two groups was whether they received our intervention or not, and therefore we know that our intervention worked to that degree. Are there any questions about that, or does that generally make sense to most people? For the 5 of you I can see, I'm seeing some head nods. So okay, I can keep going. Thank you for being representative of the rest of the group. So in the reason again that trialing and doing this kind of rigorous research is so important when we do these kinds of interventions is that common sense usually isn't enough. And these are 3 of my favorite examples. I won't go through all of them, but the Scared Straight program is a great example of something that lasted for decades, right, in many states across the country. And when finally the Campbell group actually did an RCT, a systematic review of does the Scared Straight program work, it turns out that for those young people who were put into the Scared Straight program. By the way, do we all know what the Scared Straight program is? Okay.
I don't.
No? Okay. Does anyone want to explain what the Scared Straight program is?
You're talking about that TV show thing, right?
Yeah, Kristen, you got it. Do you want to?
Yeah, no, I love that. It's basically where they take a bunch of kids who are acting out and having behavioral issues, and they're not really responding to traditional therapy options, and they take them to basically an example of a mentor who has provided examples rather to the most extreme degree of the type of behavior they're exemplifying. And it's basically this is what will happen if you don't choose a better path.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Kristen. That was an amazing summary. Well, it turns out when they did 7 randomized control trials to see if the Scared Straight program actually worked, the people who went through the Scared Straight program were 34% more likely to go on to commit a crime, and those who went through the control groups who did not go to Scared Straight were 27% more likely to go on to commit a crime. So there were all sorts of research questions like, why would this be? We all thought Scared Straight worked, right? And it turns out when they interviewed folks after the fact, some of it was about the fact that the Scared Straight program actually served to destigmatize what it might be like. They found mentors, they found role models, they found people who were like them in their communities where they, were from, and it turned out to have a backfire effect. So, so testing and trialing is always really important. Really quickly, my other favorite example is this one on the left here about pregnancy prevention. I have a bunch of graphs on it, but I don't have time to show you today. But basically, I don't know if you guys in your high school, I did in California, we had you had to carry around a sack of flour, and then they would weigh the flour at the end of the, week or whatever, how well, some people have an egg, things like that for pregnancy prevention. In some really sophisticated school districts, and in fact, 2/3 of school districts in the United States use some form of this type of pregnancy prevention. They actually use robo babies, and these babies will cry, and you need to change them, and you give them to a bunch of 16-year-old boys and girls, and they need to learn how to take care of these babies. And it turns out that when they used an RCT to study whether these robo babies were effective at preventing pregnancy, they actually found that people who had robo babies were more likely to have a child than those who did not. And again, when they interviewed participants at the end, what they realized was that, people all of a sudden were getting attention, from their friends, from their parents. They thought, I could do this. I could take care of a child, lots of backfire effects that we might not think. So again, we can go into all of that more later, but just the takeaway is trialing is really important. We really encourage governments to do lots of randomized control trials. They do not have to be multi-year, multi-million-dollar things. They can be pretty, straightforward. Happy to chat more about that at the end. Okay, before I go into the EAST framework, I'll pause and just look back. Any questions so far about the importance of testing and or behavioral insights?
And feel free to unmute or raise your hand. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
actually do have a question. Like for the baby one, would you kind of like consider Teen Mom, the TV show correlation, the way we had like Scared Straight?
Yes, that's a great. I don't know of anybody that's actually done like an RCT on teen moms, but like that's a really great question, Christian. I think you should do it.
No, I didn't even watch the show. I just know about it from my friends.
It's a great question. Anybody else?
I had a question, but maybe this is for the end when you talk more about the RCTs. But when you say that we should set up these RCTs in government and they don't need to take long or be extensive, but then the outcomes we're talking about are things like adolescent pregnancy, or we look a lot at like self-sufficiency type outcomes. Like those do take a long time to observe, and so I'm just wondering, like, how do you balance this? At least here in New Jersey, there's a desire to like roll things out statewide immediately, right? And how do you get people to really slow down when you know that the outcomes are going to take 2 years maybe to observe?
That's a great question. So I think you hit it on the head in terms of what those outcomes are. And I think as we go through the EAST framework, I'll show you lots of outcomes that are a lot sooner, like that are much quicker turnarounds, especially when we think about things like tax collection than say well-being studies. So I think that, or anything that's about public health, right? Those definitely take a lot longer. I think also I know, Pam, you didn't quite ask this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway, which is that I think the other thing that, especially having come from government, that we always need to make a trade-off about is like, what's very well studied in the literature and like, what do we sort of know for sure would be a sort of do no harm beneficence principle of like, it's okay if we make this change on this government form because it's going to be it's about simplification. We don't think it's going to have a backfire effect, but we don't know for sure, or it's been studied well enough that we're pretty sure we can go ahead with this. Versus those cases that are relatively light lift to study, but don't require a ton of like academic experts to come in and help you crunch the data or run like really sophisticated econometrics models or things like that, versus things that we consider to be like incredibly important human outcomes and or programmatic outcomes that we definitely want to study. And therefore it's worth putting the time, effort, and energy and resources behind making sure that we do those studies. So we can talk about that a little bit if you guys have specific questions for your programs. I think when we go through the EAST framework too, you're going to see like a lot of examples in practice of like a little bit more on the light lift side than, things that are weightier, like, teen pregnancy.
And Lindsay, we had one hand raised from Raul in New Jersey.
Yeah, Raul.
I don't want to dominate the conversation. I just wanted to say we've got some preliminary findings with prison populations that are re-entering into like the civilian world after a substance abuse or a behavioral situation brought them in, and we're finding that the fit between what there's like the person delivering the message and the person receiving varies. Like not everybody fits with everybody, even if you pre-select like, don't go to jail, and like this is why, to people who are already like showing risk behaviors, like they may not match up well with those personalities. So like those differential outcomes compared to expectations, I think is sort of playing out in studies like that I've been reading, and we see it in our programs here. So that's something to like that environmental factor, I guess, that randomness that Conan is describing, I think applies here potentially.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a great point. Cool. Anything else?
Looks good in the chat. Go ahead.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to move to BIT's EAST framework. And so what this is, BIT actually started out many years ago. I think it was like 2012. We published a report called Mindspace, which was an initialism or an acronym for all the things that sort of distilled under that. But then we simplified it even further. And basically, we came out with this report. It's available online. I can also send it to Kate, who could share it with you guys if you want. But it basically says this, like, if you want to change people's behavior, you need to make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. And a lot of the behavioral insights principles that are discussed in the field of behavioral science fall into one of these 4 buckets. It's not everything, but it encompasses a lot of them. So what I'm going to do is go through each each of these individually, and just tell you a little bit more about some of the behavioral science principles that fall under each of these buckets, and give you an example as well of stuff that BIT has done using these principles in practice. So let's start with making it easy. This one, not to be tautological about it, but this one should be the easiest one for everybody to understand. I think it's one that we all sort of understand intuitively. Examples of making it easy include things like defaults. So some of you might know about, for example, the organ donation defaults. So when you default people into, yes, if I die, I'd like to donate my organs, versus not, of course, organ donation rates skyrocket. And in certain countries in Europe, for example, where they've done this, waiting lists for organs have virtually disappeared, right? Versus in the US, where we still have an opt-in program for organ donation. When we go to the DMV, that, we still have a massive waiting list for folks that need organs. So defaults are tricky, right? Because I think many of you might be thinking, well, what about the political implications? This might never fly in my region, my country. Those are all incredibly good thoughts to be having. So defaults are a little bit tricky, but if you have to choose a default in a little bit less of an emotional example, like things like pension programs. So you're all state government employees, for example. Some states have a default opt into a 5% donation into your pension program contribution, and those people end up saving money over time, right? Those kinds of examples too of where you might need to use defaults, where you just opt people in. The worst example of this, and something that we like to call sludge, is when they automatically check anything you buy online, and they check, yes, of course I want to receive a bunch of emails from you for now and evermore. Those are all examples of defaults. Removing friction costs in the field of behavioral science, what we mean by friction are anything that's like unnecessary burdens to what we call administrative burdens, right, to get to what you need to do. So if we can remove friction, we'll see an example of this next, but if we can remove friction in a process to make it a little bit easier, we do see that people persist through that process a little bit longer. And then simplification of messages. Again, this is a pretty easy one to understand. Again, oftentimes from the government, we send very legal jargoned, messages to people that they don't quite understand what they're supposed to do. I love the example in labor and unemployment insurance, where people don't understand the definition, for example, of like able and available for work. Like, what does that mean? It has a very particular legal definition, but the common person doesn't quite understand what that means if you're not working in the labor space. So let me give you an example of something that we did in the UK. And this was one of our first trials that we ran. And we were asked, how can we reduce the hassle, reduce the friction of getting people to pay their overdue taxes? So we worked with HMRC, which is the UK equivalent of the IRS, so Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And basically, the HMRC wanted to send people who hadn't paid their tax yet a letter that says, look, you haven't paid your tax bill, you're delinquent, like, please go to the website and file your tax return. So what we did was we took this original letter, and on the top, this is what we call the control group. This was originally what was done, is they sent this letter. It sent them to the homepage of HMRC's website. And then on the homepage, you as the individual taxpayer had to go find the form that you needed to fill out to then submit your form to the government. All we did, this is like the simplest of simple experiments. All we did was change the direct link on the form from sending you to the web page to sending you directly to the form that the delinquent taxpayer needed to fill out to pay their taxes. And this is what we found. We found a 4 percentage point increase in people paying their tax on time. So directly coming to, now look, 4 percentage points might not sound like a whole lot, but when you're talking about thousands of people, it starts to become a lot. And in fact, in this one experiment alone, I think we brought forward £200,000 in delinquent tax revenue just by changing the link on the form, right? So we're not talking about anything magical. It's just, a small percentage especially for those of you, in large population states, right? This can actually be a pretty big difference, what we like to call practical significance, right? It's actually not only statistically significant, it's also highly practical and as well, and at no cost, right, to the government to make that change on the form. It just was updating the link. So that is the first example of how we make things easy. Making things attractive. Oh, shoot, we have a pop quiz. Okay, pop quiz time. All right, no cheating, no cheating. So this means no looking up on the Google, no screen sharing, no questioning in chats, no phoning a friend, no nothing. I really hope this is gonna work because I know my slides, aren't working quite well, but let's try this. Okay, no cheating. Again, everybody write down your answers in the chat, please. Was Mahatma Gandhi older or younger than 50 years old when he died? Please guess. How old was Mahatma Gandhi when he died? Please answers in the chat, please. Let's see. Okay, older or younger than 50 years old when he died? It's a really well-educated group too, so you guys are probably going to get this answer very right. Okay, all right, next question. Does everyone have their answer? You guys all know? Okay. Was Albert Einstein older or younger than 100 years old when he died? So older or younger than 100? You can answer that first, older or younger. And then how old was Albert Einstein when he died? Again, no phoning of friends. Okay, does everyone have their answers? Okay, great. So here are the answers. How many people guessed that Gandhi was under 78? Can I just see a quick, I'm gonna see a show of hands. Anybody guess? Okay. And how many people guessed that Einstein was over 76 when he died? Yes. Okay, fantastic. Well, you guys all did this pop quiz exactly right. Congratulations. The idea here is that anchors affect our assessments, right? So like when we told you, was Mahatma Gandhi older or younger than 50, right? That anchors you around the idea of 50. So you're kind of like, most people guess, Mahatma Gandhi was like 68 or, 55 or something like that, right? So most people were like, oh no, he was older than 50, but when I actually answer my anchor, it's going to be somewhere between like 50 and 70 years old. Similarly, 100 is your anchor here. When we ask how old was Albert Einstein, everyone's like, oh, he might have been around 100, maybe a little bit less than. So I'm going to guess like he was 92. I'm going to guess that he was 88, right? But in fact, these were about the same, right? So anchors really affect our assessments. That is one example of making it attractive. So when we think about anchoring, right, it's not, when people think of making things attractive, they think, oh, let's add pretty colors or logos or something to our, forms and make it visually appealing. And that's certainly part of making things attractive, but it's also about the ways that people start engaging with the information that you're giving them, right? So yes, grabbing attention visually is definitely part of it. People also, as we know from a lot of social media, people respond to things that are personalized, that feel really tailored for them. I personally am like incredibly shocked every time. Like I'm not a huge social media person, but every time I go on and I'm like, whoa, this was a curated, targeted ad for me. This device knows me. This is crazy. So personalization, when your name is on it or anything like that, you respond to it more effectively. Rewards and incentives, right? This is also about like, how do we structure rewards, right? People often respond. The reason the lotto works, right, is that people don't really know how to calculate expected value, and they know that millions of dollars sounds like a big thing rather than 100 awards of a smaller amount. So if you ever are doing a lotto type thing with your rewards, even though it's probably better for everybody to get a $25 Amazon gift card, if you have a $1,000 Amazon gift card, more people might participate, like making those trade-offs, right? And then also things like catering to ego and emotions, right? There's one example that I'm not going to go into, unfortunately, today, but I'll give you just a briefing on it, which is, people often, when we do focus groups and interviews, we like to do both, like very quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis, to get both, because we want to respect the fact that the customer, like the people that we're trying to serve, like have stated preferences. But oftentimes, like what people, because of the social desirability bias, people will tell you lots of things they think you want to hear, right? But when we go to crunch the numbers, they might not do those exact things. So when we think about catering to egos and emotions, what we really need to think about is like, are you motivated to do something for yourself? Are you motivated to do something for your children? Are you motivated to do something for the planet? Like, what are the different ways that we might be able to harness that, hear from people what they think that they want, and then also corroborate that with the actual quantitative data? Here's one more example that the field of behavioral science used to use before the pandemic, but I thought you guys would appreciate it. So when we think about making things attractive, this is an example of framing. So we used to tell people, look, city A or state A has a population of 600 or 6 million, whatever, 600,000 people. It's likely to be attacked by a deadly disease. Again, too soon, but I'll share it with you guys today. You must select a strategy to help city A. Now, here are the 4 programs of work, right? And these are all, again, different ways to frame the same thing, right? So program 1, this program ensures that 200 people will be saved. Program 2, there's a 1/3 probability that all 600 will be saved and a 2/3 possibility that none of them will be saved. Program 3, even after implementation of the program, 400 people will die. And program 4, 1/3 probability that no one will die and a 2/3 possibility that 600 will die. Now, barring some questions that some people ask about, like the difference between probabilistic thinking and actualized thinking, like those are all fine things to notice. What you really need to notice about this is that program 1 and 2 are framed positively, right? This is how many people will be saved. Programs 3 and 4, even though they tell you the exact same information, they frame that information negatively, right? And this is an interesting thought experiment for us here today. But when you think about things like doctors who have to go into a patient and say, you know, hey, Kristen, you know, there is a 10% probability that, you know, you will die from this procedure that we need you to do, you know, versus there's a 90% probability that you'll be just fine. And like, we need to, you know, do this procedure and save your life, you know, kind of thing. Those things actually have been studied, they've been measured, and they drastically change the way that people interact with the decisions they have to make on the other end of that framing. So again, just like a tidbit for you guys, like as you're thinking about whether you frame things positively or negatively, it can change the ways that people hear and respond to that behavior. So here's one example of what BIT did with the question of making things attractive. So the question that we were asked, I think this is in Louisville, Kentucky, we were asked, how can we settle outstanding parking fines? And what we did was we sent out parking letters that we updated. So on the left here, we see the original notice. And I know it's probably pretty small, but again, you'll get these slides later. But what you can probably see here is that there's a lot of text. It's very small, it's very dense. When I first look at this, I'm not totally sure what I'm supposed to do. I just know that I'm a delinquent violator of some kind. And what we tried to do on the right is update this to make it a little bit easier for folks to both know what it is that they're supposed to do and how to do it and by when they're supposed to do it, right? All those like key questions that we want people to pay attention to. So what you'll see here is in the top right, number 1, we put a pay now stamp. So again, it's supposed to be like, you know exactly what we want you to do when you open this letter initially. Number 2, you can see we've used some social norms, which I'll get to when we talk about making it social. But what it says is the majority of drivers who receive a parking fine in Louisville pay it within 13 days. If you do not pay your fine, your debt will be referred to a third-party collection agency. So we're trying to say, hey, look, everybody else in Louisville is doing this, like you should do it too, right? Again, we'll get to social norms in a bit. And then number 3, really where we're trying to make it attractive is we've done a couple of things here. We show exactly how much they owe. We try to nudge them to the online version because that's the most like financially profitable for Louisville by giving them the link right here to say like where to go to pay your fine. We make it easy by giving them the ticket number and their license plate number. And then we put the little symbols for like the Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, et cetera, like ways that they could pay. And we did this by explicitly drawing up exactly what we want them to do because this was the best case scenario for Louisville. They could also like send in a check, which of course creates a little bit more administrative burden for the city to have to process that check and do all that kind of stuff. And or they could call, and we left those options in at the bottom, but like really, again, tried to draw attention, make it attractive to go do it in that order and gave them everything they needed to make it easy. So what happened is that for those that received the updated letter, they were more than twice as likely to go ahead and make a payment. So if we had scaled that letter to everybody, it would bring forward about $100,000 for the city of Louisville, which for the city would be great. And again, all it is about changing the design of the letter to make it more attractive, make it easier, et cetera. And that, of course, again, was statistically significant. Oh, I have one more example. I forgot that I left 2 in here for you because I love making it attractive. So this is my favorite of the East principles. The other example that I have is we did some work with the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, about how we could get more people and specifically a more diverse police force. So people that were applying to the police force. And of course, you can imagine the entire work stream of like what it means to, you know, attract people to the application process, get them through the application process, get them through training. And then ultimately as hires, we were starting at the very top of that work stream in terms of just attracting a more diverse candidate pool into getting them onto the Chattanooga police force. So here's what we did. So we worked with, this is, I think, Sergeant Worley, and we started with 4 different messages. And I'm going to have you guess which of these messages you guys think was the most effective. So here's the first one. This was about service. So on the front of the postcard, it says, "Are you ready to serve?" On the back of the postcard, it says, "If you're the kind of person who's ready to serve, you're just the kind of person we're looking for." And again, we had the police sergeant here and the picture of Chattanooga in the background. The second message was framed around impact. So on the front of the postcard, it said, "What would it mean to you? Apply to be a police officer today." On the back, it says, "Just think what it would mean to you and your community if you became a police officer." So that's the second one, was impact. The third was challenge. So it said, "Are you up for the challenge? Apply to be a police officer today." On the back, it says, if you're the kind of person who thrives in challenging environments, you're just the kind of person we're looking for. And then the last one was about career benefits. So are you looking for a long-term career? If you're looking for a long-term career, you're just the kind of person we're looking for. Again, pretty simple. You can see on the back of the postcard, we also used other attractive qualities like personalization. So we mail merged their first names. We also gave them a short URL to go find out more. We gave them a false deadline of when to apply. Just any deadline helps anchor people to like, hey, you got to get it done by Friday, or whatever. So it's like, oh, the 28th is going to stick in my head. Got to go do that. And then again, we had Sergeant Worley on the back, right? A police officer, a real person, right? That was actually part of the Corps. And so that's a messenger effect, which again, we'll get to later. Okay, so by a quick typing in the number in the chat, please tell me if you're voting for 1 is going to win. Service message is the most impactful. 2 is the impact. What would it mean to you is the most impactful. Do number 2. If you think challenge was the most successful, please type in 3. And if you think career benefits was the most successful, please type in 4. All right, so I see some 2s. Ooh, Ellen has a cool thing. All right, 1s, 2s. I'm kind of seeing them trickle in. Great. Oh, 3, Colleen, busting the mold. Love it. Okay. Liked 2. Okay, cool. Thanks, Kate. Okay, well, are you guys ready? Everyone, submissions in. It turns out service and impact did a little bit better than no postcard, our control group, but challenge and career were more than 3 times better at getting people to apply to the police force, which was shocking to me. Again, as somebody that comes from a public service family, I was 100% on team public service. Like I was like, of course, that's how you get attracted to join public service, right? That's how you get attracted to join the police force. And interestingly, it was particularly helpful for attracting more diverse candidates. So these were women and people of color. So why might this be? Like what, like among these, does anybody have a guess as to why the challenge and career benefits messages might have done better? Again, completely contrary to my intuition. I would have said service or impact. But yeah, Kristen, I see your hands up.
Yeah, so I have an accounting degree, so I'm just going to state this from like the cold business person type's point of view. The first 2 are assuming that people are already selfless in nature. So like they're reaching out to you to tug on more of your emotional things. And nowadays in today's society, especially people who live in apartment complexes or like communities that are a little bit further out, I've just noticed that in my own personal experience, if you're like too close or too far, you have a tendency to not even know your neighbors. So from my guess is a lot of people wouldn't even know how to answer the second one.
That's a great point. Anybody else have thoughts? No wrong answers. All right, well, I'll tell you again, like what we found in sort of some of our follow-ups. So we actually did a bunch of police recruiting trials a couple years ago. I think we published a report about like how to create a more diverse police force. We worked with Elizabeth Linos, who formerly worked at BIT and is now a professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at Berkeley. And we came up with this report, and a lot of what we were finding is that things like service and impact messages were the messages that governments use all the time to attract talent, right? So these are things that a lot of us as former, me as a former government employee, but then, you all as well working in government have probably heard these messages before. And these are things that might have already started to attract you to that. We see this similarly in like teaching professions, right? Like folks who are drawn to becoming teachers kind of already know that they're going to make an impact in people's lives and that they're performing a public service. And so what we were finding is that these non-traditional messages and actually quite novel messages of like, hey, did you realize that like working in government is a pretty stable job? Like it's a pretty good, job for career growth and benefits and things like that. Were things that people hadn't ever really thought about before when they thought about careers in government. And so like changing up some of that language was actually really impactful. And again, on the measures that we were particularly interested in, which was diverse candidates, it was even more impactful than the whole population, which we thought was really promising. Okay, any questions on attractive or easy? Nope. Okay, cool. We'll move on to making it social. This is another one of my favorite examples. But before we talk about like what falls under the category of making things social, I want to tell you about one of my favorite experiments in psych history, which is the Asch experiment from 1951. So Solomon Asch was a professor, and he performed a very tricky experiment with his students, which is he got 8 to 10 students into his laboratory, and he asked them a very simple question, which is, here is exhibit 1 on the left. Which line does this match up with on the right? A, B, or C? So you guys can all see this, right? Can you see? It seems pretty obvious to all of us, right? That which one it lines up to. I mean, we can all see that it's clearly C, right? Everyone can see that it's C, right? Like this is really, no, I'm just kidding. Of course, we all know it's A. But Solomon Asch in his laboratory did this tricky thing where he had 8 to 10 students come in, and of the 10, let's just say 9 of them are what we call in the psych research were Confederates. So they were all people who were in on the experiment. And the last person, he sat the one person who didn't know what was going on at the very end of the table. So they were the person who had to guess last. And what Solomon Asch did was had his students go through and they said, which of these lined up? And every student said C, 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 or maybe it was B, 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 the wrong answer until they got to the end. And basically at the end of this, what they found was that when you are the last person and 9 people in front of you have given the same answer and it looks really obvious, right? Like what one it is, what they found is that 75% of people conformed at least once and went along with the rest of the group and said, sure, it's C, even though we can all very clearly see that it's A. And in fact, again, only 25% of people never conformed at least once. And when they did this multiple times, 32% of people went along with it very consistently. So 1/3 of the participants, every time everybody else was in agreement, they just agreed with everything else that was going on. They've done this experiment in so many different ways. Like social conformity experiments are very interesting. You guys might have heard of like Milgram or Zimbardo's experiments, which are a lot more about power and power asymmetry and things like that. But one of my favorite examples of the way that the Asch experiment has been changed is when a bunch of people are sitting in what looks like a waiting room, and all of a sudden black smoke starts coming in from under the door, and nobody else in the waiting room does anything. They just sit there and they're just like, everything is fine. And they try to see how long does it take the active participant to do something like say, hey, I think there's a fire or something else like that. And it really is fascinating how much people just go along with the social norms. It turns out that like we are still all very much our 13-year-old selves, and we want to be liked by everybody else, and we kind of want to do what everybody else around us is doing. And this is really, again, the idea about social norms. And with social norms, I think one of the really interesting things is that when you tell everybody what everybody else is doing and what the average person does, you might like, we're almost getting to tax season. So for those of you who use like, the TurboTax, right? They kind of tell you most people fall under this bracket, like you're here. And that's actually really helpful for helping to navigate through things. Similarly, like, again, you can tell part of my background is in tax collection. And so what's interesting is that, just an aside note, that a lot of the early research on tax collection uses things like social norms to say like 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay their tax on time. When I was working in the governor's office in Colorado, we actually worked with the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team on the very first tax collection trial in a state. And so we worked with the Department of Revenue in Colorado. And we were one of the first papers that showed that in the United States, where everybody has to pay their taxes. So in Canada, in the UK, other PAYE systems, which is pay as you earn systems, these taxes get taken out automatically from their paychecks. Whereas in the US, everybody has to file and pay their taxes. The US, we also have a very different history with tax collection, obviously, than a lot of other places. And so what we found is that like social norms are not working for US tax collection, which is fascinating because they're working in Canada, they're working in Australia, they're working in the UK. But when we tell, Coloradans, hey, 9 out of 10 of like your fellow Coloradans have paid their tax on time, people are just like, nah, that's okay, that doesn't work. But what does work is penalty framing. But anyway, we can talk about that later. So when you tell people you're going to get fined if you don't pay your taxes, apparently Americans are like, ooh, okay, I'm gonna pay my tax, no more fines. But that's just an aside, just an interesting across the pond difference that we're seeing. Messenger effects are also really interesting. So these are the idea that who says the message changes how people perceive it. So I don't have any children of my own, but I do have 4 godchildren and 3 nieces and nephews. And my sister-in-law will text me, and when I tell my niece, hey, you really have to do your science homework, like this is just not an option here, for some reason she's all like, woohoo, let's do some science homework. And my sister-in-law will be like, I literally just told her that an hour ago. And like, so I'm like, aunt privilege messenger effects are really great. But in the world of public policy, like what we find is that when like the governor sends a message or when the mayor sends a message, it's very differently taken sometimes than when, you know, even somebody who works in the department sends a message, right? So things like authority, or things like if you're trying to use things like reciprocity, we've done work on like pothole filling, for example, where when you show a picture of the person who's actually like filling those potholes or collecting your garbage, all of a sudden people are like putting a face to a name and realizing, oh, somebody real, somebody human is picking up my garbage. I better prepare it appropriately, right? So messenger effects, I think, can be really powerful and used in different ways, again, depending on what you want to convey. And then the last piece here about reciprocity and commitments, you might have heard about this in things like voting, right? Where I think one of my favorite examples of this is where, you know, traditionally, you know, when you get a call from a candidate, like let's just say a presidential candidate, and they're like, hi, I'm calling from the Republican Party, or hi, I'm calling from the Democratic Party. Are you planning to vote on Tuesday, right? Most people on the other end of the line, because of social desirability bias, say, yes, of course I'm planning to vote on Tuesday. And then they'll say, of course, you get the names from your voter registration list so that you know that they're registered for your party. And you say, well, are you planning to vote for our candidate? And they say, oh, yes, 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 of course, they're planning to vote for your candidate. And most political call scripts end there, right? And since the 2008 elections, this has gotten really interesting, because in the 2008 election, somebody on the Obama team decided to add a couple of extra questions to the call script. And they said, oh, excuse me, Mr. Smith, before you hang up, can I just ask, do you know how to get to where you're going on Tuesday? And, or do you know where your voting place is on Tuesday? And Mr. Smith was like, I think so. I think it's at the local school. And they're like, how do you plan to get there? And they're like, oh, I think I plan to get there by like, I'll drop, you know, little Sally off at school and then maybe go vote after. It's like, okay, great. And what time are you planning to vote? And they'll say like, oh, maybe, you know, 8:30 a.m. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Can't wait to see you Tuesday. Hung up. So what they found is that when people make more active commitments, and in that case, that was more of a planning prompt and commitment, because it forced Mr. Smith or whoever they were calling to try to think through the full process of how they plan to go vote. And just doing that was statistically significantly more likely to get people to show up and actually vote on Tuesday. So like little things like that, where people make commitments to say, yes, I'm going to do this, or they write down like, yes, I'll make a commitment to do this, can be really, really impactful. Oh, on the reciprocity thing too, just to really quickly, oftentimes we found that when we do small things for other people, even if they're very small. So this was an example. I don't have this listed, although I should have put this one in because it's one of my favorites. But we were doing a charity collection once, and at this iBank, so an investment bank. So obviously people who make lots bigger salaries than we all do, but they were asking for people's donations. And in one of the cases, there were a bunch of different treatment arms, right? So we had one case where people were going to get a motivational speech from some B-list celebrity, right? We had one case where people were given an email from the CEO, and a bunch of different things like that. And in one of the cases, we gave them a little bag of M&Ms, right? And these little bag of M&Ms cost like what, 50 cents, right? 75 cents, something like that. And people were more likely to make a donation when given a small gift, even though the donation obviously far outweighed the actual cost, right, of what they then gave us in return. So that kind of reciprocity, I think, is also really interesting, that when we do small things for others, they're much more likely to do even bigger things for us in return. And it sort of is a virtuous cycle that we can help create.
Lindsay, I want to pause, and I've gotten a couple messages from some folks who can't stay for the Q&A. It's been an hour, so some folks will drop off. I don't know if you want to pause and go to Q&A, or if you want to keep going through the slides for the folks who can join, but did just want to do a quick time check.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. I'm so sorry. I did not even realize it was 3. I've obviously been telling way too many stories. Yeah, I'm happy to pause. This is our last example, so like happy to go through it really quickly if you want, and then wrap up and we can do Q&A if that works for you, Kate.
Yeah, fantastic. Go ahead. Okay.
I will race through this one, which is, oh wait, and we also have Timely, so I apologize. Do we actually want to pause and do a Q&A? Because we do have to get through Timely as well, I forgot.
Sure.
For those that have to leave. unless you guys are like, no, let's just keep going, like if there are no questions. Okay.
I think, yeah, maybe want to run through the example and then we can kind of stop sharing the screen. And for folks who can stay and maybe want to dive in on some other projects, we can have a bit more of a conversation.
Yeah, that works. Okay,
Go ahead.
great. So when we talk about social, one of the questions again that we were asked is what's the easiest way to reduce overprescribing of antibiotics? This was an example that we used in the UK, where we took the top 20% of antibiotic prescribers in the UK and we sent them this message, just letting them know that the great majority, 80% of other practices prescribe fewer antibiotics. Here's what we found is that, you know, again, what we're really looking at is the difference between the blue line and the dark gray line. So people who did not receive our letter prescribed more antibiotics than those who received a letter. And by the time we gave them both letters, everybody stopped reducing antibiotic prescriptions. What was really interesting about this is that, like, again, we saved something like close to 75,000 doses of antibiotics. The Public Health England had actually put out something like a $23 million campaign to get doctors to stop prescribing antibiotics. And our letter intervention cost about £5,000. It would have been cheaper, but we had a printing error. And so again, lower cost, big reward. We got about 85% of the way to their goal of a 1 percentage point reduction in antibiotic prescribing. And then again, really quickly, the last one on our list is about making things timely. And again, this is really more about like when you ask people to do things, the timing of it can be really important, as well as we gave the example earlier of like planning prompts and voting. And then there's something called hyperbolic discounting, which everybody should know about. And it's this idea that we all value things now more than things in the future, right? So if I were to ask, you know, Jennifer, do you want $100 today or $125 3 months from now? Most people would say $100 today. You know, with current inflation, maybe that's not the best example, but in general, people value things currently rather than in the future. So again, we do lots of things about like if you were to pick your dessert, I'm a sucker for chocolate cake, so I would pick chocolate cake if asked in the moment. But if you ask me, hey, Lindsay, next Thursday, when you have to pick your dessert, would you rather have chocolate cake or a fruit salad? Most people will make better decisions for themselves in the future because it's not seen as like an immediate cost today. Can give you, again, very quick example of a license renewal deadline. This one's from Colorado. So we worked with the city of Denver on trying to get people to go online to renew their licenses. And this is, again, examples of how we did this. And what we found is that by making it, again, more timely, where we had people do planning prompts and we had them do checklists and have them, you know, commit to when they were going to renew online, more people ended up renewing online, saving a trip to the DMV. There are lots of implications, again, for nudging people to go online to do government services, especially post-pandemic. I think it's a really good opportunity to think about those things more fully. But again, if we had scaled up these interventions to everybody, we would have had about 9,000 more renewals online rather than going to the DMV, standing in line and getting their renewals in person. Okay, so that's the end. Again, sorry to race through that at the end there. But in summary, behavioral insights can help us understand the ways that people are predictably irrational with how they interact with these kinds of policies and programs, and help to teach you how to work with those kinds of biases rather than against them. Evaluation, as we know, is really, really important. It can help us narrow in on what works, when, and for whom, and that using this kind of rigorous empirical method for driving impact is actually a lot easier and cheaper than you might think. So go forth and nudge wisely. And then here's my contact information. Although again, I think Kate will send this around if you guys have other questions, or if you've got a particular program that you're like, oh, could behavioral insights be used for this? I'm always happy to hop on the phone and have a chat about it as well. And I will stop sharing so that we can all come back together.
Fantastic. Lindsay, what a wonderful presentation, and so generous of you to include your contact information. She stopped screen sharing. So when we chatted about this, we just thought it would be nice to kind of open up time for you all to dive in and get engagement from, I mean, a true expert on behavioral insights who works with governments around the world on these issues. So this is really your time. If you want to pop in, you know, ask a question, talk about a challenge you're facing, we'll open up the floor to you all. Feel free to unmute or raise hands, or however you want to dive in.
Well, if no one else, I can have a question. We don't quite have the resources within our department to be doing a randomized control study kind of in the moment. We're kind of doing it. We'll have everyone gets the same thing one year, and then we'll make changes the